Hello, everyone. We have been exposed to daily doses of media coverage regarding the COVID-19 rules and regulations, but what stands behind those rules? Today, we will talk about the pieces of legislation that stand behind the COVID-19 restrictions in England. Let's think about the pandemic as a big pot of soup. On the menu, we've got potato soup. The pot has been simmering on the stove of the UK government for over a year now. We may like or dislike the taste or the smell of this soup, but it is out there for universal consumption. Now, new ingredients or new rules are being added to the soup weekly. The main chefs in our kitchen are the UK government and the UK legislature. The UK legislature passes primary legislation in the form of Acts of Parliament, as well as the regulations. The UK government and the legislature use the so-called emergency powers, which refer to the government's power to respond rapidly to public emergencies. They make regulations without an act of parliament. The government also takes actions without complying with statutory duties that the government would normally have to comply with. And the government takes action that it would not normally be allowed to take. So, what are the ingredients? Let's start with the basics. We've got onions, we've got the potatoes, which will make up the bulk of our soup. And we've got cream, or any other dairy or non-lactose product of your preference. The onion represents the Public Health Control of Disease Act, 1984. The potatoes represent the Coronavirus Act 2020, a newer piece of legislation, which works in tandem with the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984. The cream represents the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Steps England Regulations 2021. These are widely known stages or restrictions that have been implemented across the UK. We're currently in stage or step 3 of these regulations, which allows us to live relatively freely, with most businesses open and the ability to gather in groups of up to 30 people, amongst other things. The 1984 Act contains powers to deal with pandemics when they present significant harm to human health. It was previously used 12 times before, typically during industrial actions in the late 20th century. The Coronavirus Act 2020 builds upon the 1984 Act with additional items specific to the pandemic. The 1984 Act allows lockdowns to be enforced, such as in March and October 2020 and January 2021, plus other restrictions on meeting friends, closing shops, working from home, etc. Under the Act, magistrates have the power to make someone submit to a medical examination, detain them in hospital, hold them in quarantine, and make them abstain from working or trading. Altogether, these are known as wider restrictions, which many people disagree or simply do not want to comply with. But they are lawful because they are contained in an Act of Parliament and are enforceable by state officials. Now, what about the Coronavirus Act? How does it build upon the 1984 Act? Well, it changed the law in a number of different areas. For example, it introduced new police powers in relations to potentially infectious people. It added changes to mental health laws. It changed local authority duties in relation to social care and changed the government surveillance powers. Again, quite broad. But what rights do you have if a policeman comes up to you claiming that, for example, you're not keeping the 2-meter distance rule? Policemen can only enforce the law which is set out in the primary legislation and regulations. However, they cannot enforce guidance. Guidance isn't law. That means policemen will not be able to fine you in case you keep a lesser distance. You can freely walk away without answering policemen's questions, obviously without being rude. Now, what are the constraints on the use of emergency powers? The use of emergency powers should be proportionate to the scale of the threat. The regulations introduced under the Coronavirus Act must be consistent with the Human Rights Act on paper. To a wide extent, it is consistent with the Human Rights Act. Whenever we talk about the right to life, the right not to be tortured, the right of free speech, the Coronavirus Act is drafted in a way which attempts to be consistent with the HRA. And even if a person brings a claim about the breach of his or her freedom of expression because public protests are halted, there will be pieces of legislation which will prevent such a claim from succeeding in court. The government has stated that the emergency measures to tackle the coronavirus will be limited to 2 years. However, most likely the act will be redrafted once again and extended if need be. That's all for today. I know many of you do not like the taste of this potato soup, and I know that, of course, salt and pepper are added together with the herbs, but the government sticks with the 3 main ingredients that we have to live with for now. As mentioned, health and safety of the public take precedence over our individual desires. Thank you for listening.